Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for tuning back in again. We are going to continue with the second section of our notes and continue on to the next critical thinking question. The Manhattan Project. So Robert Oppenheimer was put in charge of developing the bomb. From the years of 1942 to 1945, a number of secret labs across the country developed and built the bomb. Now, of course, this would happen in many different locations, from Chicago to Oak Ridge to Trinity and Hanford. Physicist Enrico Fermi at the University of Chicago developed the nuclear reaction. Then, of course, followed by nuclear plant in Hanford, Washington, developed the plutonium for it. Then, followed by the bomb being constructed in a secret city in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And then, of course, in July of 1945, the bomb was successfully tested at Los Alamos, New Mexico during Project Trinity. Here's a picture of what the bomb actually looked like. And here's a picture of the test. So in April of 1945, FDR did die, and his vice president, Harry Truman, had to decide how to end the war in the Pacific. Truman's greatest intrigue was not necessarily just the bomb, but getting caught up to pace quickly about the status of the war. In July of 1945, the Big Three met at the Potsdam Conference to discuss the end of World War II. And of course, they're talking about Stalin and Churchill. Now, Truman learned the atomic bomb was ready and issued the Potsdam Declaration to Japan to surrender or face destruction. Now, when Japan refused to surrender, Truman ordered the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Here's some facts and information about Hiroshima the day of fire. With ground temperatures, hurricane force winds, energy being released, buildings destroyed, the number of people who were killed immediately, staggering, and of course the number of people dead by implications of the bomb and total deaths taken into account together, quite staggering numbers here, as you can see. So after 3 days, Japan did not surrender, so a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. These pictures here speak volumes about the carnage and the destruction. Now, after the second atomic bomb, Emperor Hirohito agreed to the terms of a surrender. And this headline over here depicts what I'm sure must have been the joy inside the United States at the time of hearing news of the surrender. World War II was over. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next critical thinking question. So in our notes here, Vice President Harry Truman became president after Roosevelt unexpectedly died in April 1945, while attending an Allied conference in Potsdam, Germany 3 months later. Truman received a telegram stating that the tests of the atomic bomb had been successful. By this time in the war, Germany had been utterly defeated. However, Japan had vowed to fight on. Despite the Allies' demand at Potsdam for unconditional surrender, the Japanese felt that the unconditional surrender would jeopardize the position of their emperor, whom they considered divine or godlike. In addition, the Japanese viewed surrender as dishonorable, so they fought with fanatic resistance and believed it was more honorable to commit suicide than to surrender to enemy forces. In this vein, Japanese kamikaze pilots strapped themselves into planes loaded with explosives and crashed them onto American naval vessels. They managed to destroy 53 ships and damage 158 others. Despite these desperate attacks, the Japanese were close to defeat by July of 1945. 3 factors were working against them. First, Allied bombing runs over Japanese home islands were killing tens of thousands of civilians and military personnel. Second, an Allied naval blockade made it impossible for Japan to import the goods necessary to continue fighting and prevented 1 million Japanese troops in China from returning to their homeland. Third, the massive Soviet Red Army was poised to enter the war and assist the United States. The United States had hoped to end the Pacific War by invading the home islands of Japan. However, in the face of Japanese fanaticism, Truman was deeply concerned that such an invasion would cost tens of thousands of American lives. In light of this concern, some of Truman's advisors recommended that they end the war quickly by dropping a bomb without warning on a large Japanese city. The Undersecretary of the Navy, Ralph Bard, disagreed and told Truman that dropping the bomb without a specific warning would jeopardize, quote, the position of the United States as a great humanitarian nation, end quote. A group of scientists from the bomb project suggested that the United States drop the bomb in a remote, unpopulated location to show the bomb's power and convince Japan to surrender. But consider this, what would you have done? Critical thinking question B. You're a close advisor to President Truman. Which of the following do you advise the President to do? Be prepared to defend your answer. Without warning, drop an atomic bomb in a Japanese city as soon as possible. drop the bomb in an unpopulated area to demonstrate its destructive capabilities? Warn the Japanese that the United States possesses atomic weapons and is willing to use them if they don't surrender in a specified time? If they don't surrender, then drop the bomb? Reject the use of atomic weapons and continue the naval blockade and conventional bombing? If the measures do not produce a Japanese surrender, invade Japan. Or reject the use of atomic weapons and negotiate an end to World War II, allowing the Japanese to surrender with their emperor as part of the post-war agreement. So, of course, for those of you who might know your history and identifying really what would have been done here, you know what happens. And of course, you can support your own opinion here after you choose whatever option, and place it right here. However, for clarity and context, we can tell you what happens right now. So basically, and given what we know now with history, essentially President Truman made the decision to drop the bomb. Although, in reality, the conclusions of the efforts made to drop the bomb did bring about an end to the war, the fact is that the impact of World War II was quite stark. World War II was the biggest, most deadly, and most impactful war in world history. In looking at World War I compared to World War II, you can see some stark differences between civilian and military deaths from World War I to World War II. Additionally, World War II was not only hard for the United States and Japan, but also for other countries as well, especially when you look at military casualties. Now, it should be noted here that in terms of concluding this, Europe was destroyed by the war and lost its place as the epicenter of the power in the world. The United States and the USSR emerged as superpowers and rivals competing for influence in the world. A United Nations was formed to replace the League of Nations and to help promote peace, and colonized nations began to demand independence from Europeans. Let's consider the last critical thinking question, and then we'll be good to close out. Decision C. Whether Truman actually made the right decision. So immediately following the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Japan, the majority of Americans felt the right decision has been made. Surveys conducted by Fortune magazine in the fall of 1945 revealed that over 50% of Americans believed that the United States, quote, should have used the 2 bombs on cities just as we did. Another 22.7% felt the United States should have quickly used many more bombs before Japan had the chance to surrender. American soldiers also supported Truman's decision. One young soldier stated, when the bombs were dropped and news began to circulate that the invasion of Japan would not take place after all, that we would not be obliged to run up the beaches near Tokyo assault firing while being mortared and shelled, we cried with relief and joy. We were going to live. We were going to grow up to adulthood after all. Now, many officials in the top ranks of the military and government supported Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs. However, others expressed doubts. Admiral William D. Leahy stated that it is my opinion that the rise of barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons. My own feeling was that, being the first to use the atomic bomb, we adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. Dwight D. Eisenhower, a general with enormous prestige, expressed the hope that the United States would never have to use such a weapon against an enemy again, because he disliked seeing the country initiate the use of anything so horrible and destructive. Now, some historians have severely criticized Truman's decision. They argue that the Japanese were already defeated in August of 1945, and the atomic bombs were used primarily as a warning to the Soviet Union. Now, although there were allies during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union had very different visions for the post-war world. The Soviets wanted to maintain control over Eastern Europe, and the United States wanted the Soviets to provide independence to Eastern European countries. Historians critical of Truman's decision argue that he authorized the use of atomic bombs mainly to scare the Soviets out of Eastern Europe and to keep them from gaining more territory in Asia. To these historians, the citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were sacrificed in a high-stakes poker game between the 2 superpowers. They also argue that the post-war nuclear arms race can be traced back to the fear and mistrust created by Truman's decision. Other historians countered that the military pressures Truman was under at the end of World War II played a much more important role in his decision than the threat of Soviet aggression. Please answer the critical thinking question for C. Truman's decision to use the atomic weapons against Japan is one of the most controversial in history. In retrospect, do you think Truman made the right decision in authorizing the use of atomic weapons? Choose an answer and explain. Truman did not make the right decision when he authorized the use of the atomic weapons, or Truman made the right decision when he authorized the use of atomic weapons? Please explain right here. So as you guys can see, understanding Japan and the United States and the events of the wars in the Pacific help us understand not only World War II from a better perspective, but also helps us understand the essence of how the world would be forever changed after the fact. My hope is that you learned a little bit more about the war experience from the Japanese perspective too by this presentation. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.